So this is our concluding plenary. We've got an amazing panel discussion with people who are going to be reflecting on engagement and research and the futures of engaged research. So without more ado, I'm going to welcome Jaideep Gupta, who we've invited to chair this session for us.
Colleagues, Sophie, thank you so much for inviting me to chair this panel. So my name is Jaideep Gupta, and I'm currently the Director of Research, Strategy Innovation at the Arts and Humanities Research Council. I'm male in my mid-40s of South Asian Indian heritage. My pronouns are he, him. I'm wearing a striped shirt and a dark blue blazer, and I'm sat in what seems like a somewhat surprisingly sunny study at home for the time of year it is and the sort of weather we've been having. Now, I trust all of you have been having a wonderfully engaged day. And I have with me two amazing speakers. We've had the opportunity to share some of our ideas in advance of this, so I know they have some fascinating thoughts to share with you. If I can just ask Mai and Pen to introduce themselves very briefly, just to check that your video cameras and mics are working. Mai.
Hello, good afternoon. A pleasure to be here, and thank you for the very kind invitation to join you. I am May Monsieur. I'm currently the Inclusion and Participation and Engagement Fellow at the School of Advanced Study. I'm also supporting research impact in the research engagement and innovation services at Swansea University. And I'm a project manager at the Oxford Research Centre of Humanities at the University of Oxford.
Thanks so much, May. We could hear you very clearly. Pen, can I hand to you?
Thank you, Jaideep. Hello, everyone. My name is Pen Yuanxin. You can just call me Pen. I am currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bristol. Preferred English pronouns he or they with no strong preference. My original academic background is in ecology and conservation research, where I used to spend more time with wildlife than humans, but later I started a citizen science project doing my PhD. And in more recent years, I've been doing a lot of work on different aspects of open research and meta research, which is part of the work I'm doing in Bristol right now. All of this has stimulated a lot of different thoughts about in my head about engagement, because I've been doing different kinds of engagement even as I was doing all of the above. And hopefully I'll be able to capture some of that and share it with you. Really honored to be here with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pen. And equally, we could hear you very clearly and see you clearly as well. Right, now, before I hand back to May and Pen to hear their thoughts, I've been asked to share a few framing ideas myself to get the panel up and running. So to do this, I wanted to share 4 ideas with you, which, as I was writing them out this morning, I thought, not long ago, these would be termed as provocations on public engagement. But considering how much innovation progress we have had over the past 5, even 10 years, these ideas are now essentially fundamental principles around public engagement. But let me put them before you and then say a few words on each. So the first is that public engagement is an integral part of the research ecosystem. The public engagement provides a clear pathway to reaching diverse and broader audiences, but that sustained partnership building with communities requires long-term investment. And the fourth idea was that public engagement professionals have a central role to building positive institutional cultures. Now, let me say a couple of words on each of these. And I wanted to do so from the point of view of my role at the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and as a consequence from being part of the UKRI, UK Research and Innovation family as well. So on the first, on recognizing public engagement as an integral part of the research ecosystem, UKRI as a funder, I can confidently say, understands how important it is to researchers that their and their research, that their research connects with communities, and it does so in accordance with relevance, value, and importance that research has to people's everyday lives. I think this has become, as I said, less of a provocation to what innovative research looks like, and more of a fundamental principle of what good research looks like. You know, a year ago, UKRI published, I think it was the first public engagement strategy setting out priorities with a strong focus on how public engagement should give people a voice. The idea was very much to allow them to have a say and influence research and researchers, breaking down the barriers between research and society. And the strategy focused on building a sense of shared endeavor by making research relevant and accessible. It called for supporting collaborative collaboration and sort of valuing diverse forms of research to make sure the benefits of research were shared widely, and in creating opportunities for all by inspiring and having a focus on and engaging with the next generation. Right, and right across UKRI, there's a range of initiatives to support and enable public engagement. And I thought it was worth noting that this doesn't only happen through the direct activities around funding calls, but also through strategic partnerships, the sort of internal change programs to review processes and policies to embed public engagement in funding. Now at AHRC, our thematic approach to funding has, in my view, seen some imaginative and exciting public engagement projects. So linked to the centenary of the BBC in 22, and the rich discussions about the future of healthcare, future of social care as part of the 75th anniversary of the NHS. And you know, these have seen researchers exploring BBC programming in the 1960s with South Asian communities in, say, Southampton, and intergenerational conversations about the future of health and care in Highlands and Islands of Scotland. And I see that diverse and new voices is quite a recurring theme across these projects. And this speaks to that second principle, that public engagement provides that clear pathway to reaching diverse and broader audiences, often connecting with communities that have no history of engaging with research or indeed higher education. And I think that is quite an empowering position for researchers as well as the public. Just to note, elsewhere in the UKRI family, so in the Science and Technology Facilities Council, STFC, they have prioritized supporting engagement with underrepresented groups through their Wonder initiative. This is seen as an increasing in the proportion of STFC's engagement activities reaching the most socio-economically deprived areas of the UK. And of course, another example is the Community Knowledge Fund. You know, UKRI uses that as a pathway to explore what happens when we flip that usual approach to public engagement and give funding directly to community groups. And there's 24, I think, community-led projects across the UK that are exploring topics ranging from safety, resilience, environment, sustainability, and indeed structural racism. And although those are short term, these dedicated public engagement funding calls enable experimentation and innovation so that UKRI gains valuable learning, in my view, that can be brought back into the organization, shared with colleagues and indeed the wider sector, and incorporated into funding calls. I think that's quite an important avenue of change making for us as a group that are interested in public engagement to take note of. And I think this is where real system change can happen, when public engagement does become embedded as a core part of research proposals. And more we will see public engagement in funding criteria. And I wanted to take this opportunity just to point out an example from HRC's portfolio. So there's a Center for Law and Social Justice, I think, is a prime example where public engagement will play a key role of the work of this center as a route to engage those with lived experience of our legal system. And ultimately, our intention is that this will help the research that the center delivers and the potential for impact too. And then just briefly on the third and fourth principles that I laid out earlier, the sustained partnership building with communities requires that long-term investment. And this is why I think UKRI's Community Research Network, CRNs, are important to point out here, that those are investing in those long-term community infrastructures to build capabilities of communities to engage with and indeed use and influence research and innovation. I think this is a response to our scoping, review, and engagement with community groups that has shown that community-based networks, organizations, indeed brokers, are quite important intermediaries between the RNI system and grassroots communities. And the importance of brokers, I think, is also highlighted in AHRC's current opportunities to support a music hub. So this is an opportunity that is focused on the important role of that public engagement professionals play at universities by recognizing the need for their advice, their guidance in project teams. And similarly, brokers have been seen as integral to success of projects funded through UKRI's Highlands and Islands Climate Change Community Grants, there's citizen science collaboration grants, indeed the mindset and missions. So a range of investment opportunities that are experimenting indeed and bringing into practice some of these ideas. And I think it's important just to go back to the mention of brokers, because it's important to recognize the support researchers and how that supports the researchers can develop the skills and confidence for public engagement in the research community and connect them to opportunities. And here, I think, an example that I find quite fascinating is the Being Human Festival, where researchers get a real opportunity to test ideas and indeed sort of bring their ideas in the humanities space to engage with the public and to see how it lands with that wider audience. And then to underscore, and I promise I'll stop here. This is I feel quite passionately about this, that public engagement professionals have indeed come to be quite central in building that positive institutional culture that nurtures public engagement, and the way it enables the research and innovation system ecosystem to flourish. And certainly we'll be celebrating some of this success right after this panel with the Engage Watermark Awards. And I think they'll continue to be quite integral to the next step changes in public engagement professionals, that is. And to me, that is a vision for a more inclusive, more equitable relationship between research, innovation, and society. And I was quite excited when Sophie sort of introduced me to this conference, saying that there'll be many public engagement professionals in the audience and sort of driving this really exciting area of work forward. So I was very pleased to join. But with that, let me now bring in our panelists, and May and Pen, please don't use those 4 guiding principles as in any way to be limiting on your ideas, but I did draw on our previous conversations to build on those a little bit. So May, if I can call on you to offer your thoughts on the role of public and community engagement within the universities or higher education sector, and perhaps offer what you feel allows research and innovation to be relevant and accessible to all.
Chiming with a lot of the things that you said about research being this kind of, sort of moving towards inclusion, moving towards engagement. I often look at it when we look at Engage, I think of multiple perspectives. I tend to think of it in a intersectional way. A lot of my experiences, my own personal experiences, have been formulated over time, and being in that kind of university space, in that kind of community space. I have, for the last 15 odd years, been working in access and outreach and public engagement and knowledge exchange, and also been a researcher too, as an ancient historian. And I'm often kind of struck by the sort of sometimes a disconnect that we tend to have between being from a kind of professional staff, as well as being in a kind of in academic roles, and the fact that research doesn't actually happen in vacuum. You know, there is that sort of saying of where it takes a village, you know, to raise a child. And in a sense, this is what we're talking about. If we're talking about research that is incredibly relevant, which is make societal changes, then we have to take in all these multiple perspectives. I do have a few examples that we can kind of use as an you know, sort of to discuss what does engaged research look like, and what does it mean by being intersectional when it comes to that. I'm currently looking at a project working with the sort of modern Ethiopian Eritrean diaspora communities in the UK, and using classical mythology storytelling as a vehicle to talk about migration, forced migration and exile. A lot of the things that I have sort of experienced through my previous work in public engagement and supporting researchers in impact and so forth, is coming to the fore now, you know, and to try and think about how do we become responsible for communities to come into this space, and to give them the platform to speak and to, you know, sort of contribute to the research. And so this research project in some ways is quite sort of innovative, and, you know, takes in the co-curation aspect, the participatory aspect, but also the kind of ethical, the responsible side that we as researchers have to take into account too. One of the things that I'm very much influenced by, and I will put this in the chat, is a story that happened in 2018, of where a Brazilian museum caught fire. And it talks about the sort of rebuilding of that museum, and I'll just pop it in the chat if I can. I'm just going to see if it's not quite direct message, but to everyone. And this has really influenced me in the fact of, you know, how can scholars from those marginalized communities, you know, sort of indigenous communities, can rebuild, you know, sort of institutions that are primarily sort of built in a very kind of westernized idea of what research is, of what engagement is, and what collections are. And so in some ways, I have absolutely been thinking about how to do responsible research in the ecosystem. And when we talk about, you know, sort of research, we're not just talking about university institutions, but we're also talking about the kind of greater extended you know, sort of public spaces like museums and art galleries and libraries and so forth. The other example that I really want to talk about too is, in a sense, the the kind of sort of co-curation aspect. I worked a lot in classics and trying to sort of diversify our discipline, and I co-founded a project called Classics and Communities. Now, with that project itself led to a REF impact case study, which many of us are very familiar with, but it also involved a study across globally, who, you know, sort of coming from different backgrounds in trying to get classics in their communities, and actually being part of that kind of impact case study themselves, contributing articles to the overall, you know, sort of academic handbook, which then was submitted for REF, and, you know, fortunately had 4 stars. But it's that kind of aspect of where it's a community targeted approach in order to kind of pursue and move forward our kind of research goals. And I do work again in that kind of impact world where we are supporting our researchers. So a lot of the time, I myself am trying to sort of get researchers to think about, okay, so it's not about knowledge transfer, it's about knowledge exchange, it's that kind of equitable relationship that you are building with partners, and they should be taken with you, not, sort of picked and, dropped at the most convenient point. So for me, I think there are really important things about being responsible, being intersectional, and being as inclusive as possible, and to not work in vacuum. So I guess that's my kind of pointers in some ways.
Thank you, May, for that really helpful summary at the end as well. And I was almost lost in that lovely New York Times article that you just shared. What a wonderful picture and graphic as well, and such a powerful story there. I'm sure we'll come back to things like REF, and thank you, Sophie, for clarifying that that stands for Research Excellence Framework. Please, everyone, the more we can bust acronym usage, the better. So if do use acronyms, it helps the conversation along. But if you don't know what something means, just ask, and we'll try and get to the bottom of it. Again, let me remind colleagues, Q&A functions open, so pose your questions to May, myself, or Pen as they come up. But while I do that, Pen, can I ask you to offer your opening thoughts on, I suppose, similarly, on the role of public and community engagement, and what makes the research and innovation system inclusive through public engagement. Over to you, Pen.
I think I'd like to begin by quickly acknowledging a couple of things. The first one is that I've been on, what I sometimes call the academic hamster wheel for most of my career. So most of my perspectives come from having been an academic researcher for so long, with all the benefits, but also the limitations and constraints on my perspective that come with it. So I want to acknowledge my potential ignorance there and ask for your understanding. The other thing is that I like to use some examples from my experience running a citizen science project. And I also want to acknowledge on this point that citizen science itself is actually a somewhat contentious academic term. And without having time to go into the details, I just want to acknowledge that there are certain things that it might not cover, will not cover in a equitable way. So I just want to note that before going into my comments. But anyway, I think the two things I'd like to share are, again, my experience starting a citizen science project, and the other one being my more recent experience over the past few years on advocating for more open research across different disciplines. So starting with citizen science, again, my original training is in ecology and conservation research, and I have also been doing various forms of public engagement in what I think is a more stereotypical sense along the way. I, for example, took a course even as an undergrad on how to design and deliver public engagement events. Which was very eye-opening for me. And by the time I was based at Durham University, I was very lucky to work with, for example, my supervisor, Phil Stevens, or the public engagement officer, Lorraine Coquille, at Durham University to help start the MammoWeb project. So it was a citizen science network started, oh man, it's like almost 8 years ago now, where we worked with local communities to monitor wildlife. And I have to admit, I started out being incredibly naive. I just thought, maybe I can use my public engagement skills to, rope some people into doing a lot of wildlife observations for me to help collect data for me. I admit that's a very limited and naive perspective, because one of the biggest lessons I learned along the way is from the people that I was so lucky to work with over the years. And I'd like to name a couple of people there, including someone called Roland Ashcroft and Kelly. So they are local people who still, I think, lives in the Durham area. And originally, I was able to convince them to do a lot of wildlife observations for me, for my research, but they became really interested, right? And turns out that they started their own research projects completely independently from me or the university. And Anne actually started giving trainings to other wildlife interest groups where she travels around and doing these trainings. Or in Roland's case, he was interested in the wildlife near his village, and he started his own research, discovering what's out there. And turns out that the data he collected was enough to inform the designation of a local nature reserve near where he lived. Now, I like to mention these things for two reasons. Number one is that when it comes to citizen science, I started out thinking of it as just a form of engagement where I get people to do stuff for me as an academic. And turns out that this is very often how it takes shape, because if you look at the citizen science literature, it often talks about, we need to take care of these citizen scientists. We need to engage them. We need to make sure that they're happy and so on and so on. There are these techniques because they will collect better data for us, or they will, improve the research that we want to do. And academics are very often motivated by the pressures of having to, for example, publish in really high profile journals, right? Or having to win a lot of grants and funding. So ultimately, all of this engagement very often ends up being in the service of the academic rather than really thinking about all of our participants as collaborators, where we bring different sets of expertise into the same research to fulfill for what we all want to do together. And unfortunately, the other side of this is that even though Roland is doing such robust research, I remember Phil, my supervisor, saying that, hey, his work is so good that if he actually, did it as part of a degree program at the university, he would have at least gotten a thesis, a master's degree out of it. That's the level that his research was at. But when Anne and Roland wants to do their research, there's no support for them to do that. They're and they have to figure out ways of doing all of this on their own. And I think that's a really unfortunate aspect of how a lot of this kind of engagement ends up being. And just super quickly, my other point about open research is that when it comes to open research, I always like to think back to this difference between science and alchemy, which I learned from Cory Doctorow, who is a very famous author. And he observed that if you look at alchemists back in the day, superficially, they were doing experiments, they took lots of notes, they actually learned a lot of things. But alchemists kept what they learned a secret from each other. And because of this, they didn't advance the state of the art. And every single alchemist had to learn in the hardest possible way that drinking mercury is a bad idea. And I think that's the difference between alchemy and science. And if you look back to the original roots of the word science, it's actually just about knowledge in general, rather than the STEM focused science that we colloquially talk about today. Now, why do I say all of this? Because I think in academic circles, people talk about open research as a way for scientists, oh, you can make it reproducible so other scientists can reproduce it, or you should publish your data so that it increases innovation for the scientists and academics and so on. Those are great benefits, but it's also a way of being accountable and transparent to wider society, right? And as part of this, by doing open science and sharing what we do, we are demonstrating to the wider society that research and knowledge generation is a fundamentally iterative process where we are always building on what came before. And to demonstrate that we're not being alchemists and that we are actually learning together. And I think it is very important when it comes to public engagement for people practicing research to demonstrate that they're not alchemists. And I think that's why open research also has a lot to do with public engagement. Sorry, I know I already took a lot of time, so I'll stop there. But hopefully
Thank-
that's some useful stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Pen. No, you didn't take too much time at all. And like May, I think those opening comments were have sparked the imagination. So, you know, an immediate litmus is that people have already started using the Q&A function to send in what I think are quite profound questions. So we've been challenged by the audience to speak about the sort of aha moments that each of you have personally had to overcome particular barriers. I think both of you have begun to mention your own personal journeys, indeed specific research projects that have really driven you to where you are today. But indeed, those projects have also driven the broader ecosystem, right? Like there's a point to note here that your ideas, your actions have had impact in the wider world in very many different ways. But could I come to each of you to just talk of if you were asked for that one aha moment, that real hero moment where you recognized that you had in some way, Pen, moved from that position of naiveness. I think we all are naive in our own ways, and it's wrong for us to assume that we'll ever not be naive when it comes to progressing the frontier of knowledge. May, what if you were to pick out a moment where you had that sort of transformational or the feeling of transformational change where you indeed had crossed barriers or built those bridges to a more inclusive ecosystem, what would an example look like?
That is quite a big question. I suppose there are two things. One, with regards to my own research, where I've come across intellectuals like Edward Said, who has influenced a lot of my work that I do, and thinking about institutions and the way that they are constructed, and the biases that are inbuilt in those. And in that sense, that for me was quite a sort of revolutionary sort of eye-opener to the world, let alone to just how universities and public space institutions, etc., are built. And so for me, that kind of opened my eyes in some respect, and then working in places like Oxford University, I've been working there for over 10 years. Certainly those things have appeared time and time again of sort of pushing back against that kind of inherent institutional sort of biases when it comes to just pretty much everything. So in some ways, Edward Said's work informs my research, but also the way that I am as a person and how I look upon the world. And then the other part is really my kind of public engagement work, that in a sense started off in the classics faculty, and then over time I ended up at the Bodleian Libraries doing a lot of the managing the public engagement program, and thinking about sort of bringing different communities into that space. I mean, being in Oxford, it's that kind of, you've got that double-edged sword of an institution that is steeped in this kind of sort of history and of, I suppose, of violence and imperialism and colonialism, and then trying to connect to its local community, let alone international community, but its local community, and the fact that it couldn't, and so then building or rebuilding relationships with different communities within that kind of Oxfordshire system, and then realizing, oh my goodness, we just have to completely change the way that we work. And there's a really great question in the Q&A of like, does the public even want to get involved sometimes? And it's absolutely brilliant question, because it's like I can see it from both perspectives. As somebody who sort of has worked with from sort of people from Chinese background, Syrian background, but also from my own background, Ethiopian Eritrean background, what is relevant for us as a community member may not be relevant for the researchers and vice versa. But then, you know, it gets pushed by universities and this, oh, we have to do this. We have to kind of, you know, sort of it's part of, you know, we need to measure impact. We need to show impact. And so we're having to kind of target these communities, but then you leave them behind once that is done. So it really, one thing that I tend to battle with is learning from, you know, sort of people around me and, you know, sort of really incredibly sort of intelligent people within the communities that don't have academic hats and that inform us. But it's also like how to be responsible. And I'm afraid with things like, you know, sort of grants that are just within such a short time frame to produce something so, you know, sort of something that should be you know, embedded and has depth and quality, you know, time and time again, I have this kind of aha moments and this kind of transformative moments I learn that I want to put in place. And yet I'm restricted by the kind of financial side of things that universities and research institutions tend to put in place. And it's like, you can't have both. You cannot ask for societal change and yet put such little money or time into this. And so there is that kind of dichotomy, really, I struggle with.
Thanks, May, and that's that's a wonderfully profound response to what you're right to pick out that question as amazingly imaginative. I mean, I drew from your response, I think, what is a characteristic of successful stakeholders in the research and innovation system, and that is those who can use institutions or navigate institutions to understand where change is possible and when change is possible. I think that's you. I think your story kind of shows that, right? And indeed, there's some institutions that are deeply steeped in all sorts of histories, let alone colonial histories, that need to, you know, your position on public engagement needs to counteract those positionalities before even you get to your research question or anywhere near your research question. But understanding how you navigate those pathways is so important. And a reflection for me before I come to you, Pen, on whether or not the public is actually interested. I think there's two ways that I see it. One is that, you know, I've been amazed and surprised at the sorts of research the public does engage with. And we often tend to underestimate the public, right? I mean, first of all, I think we need to speak of it in the plural, publics. There's very many shapes and forms to how we can conceptualize the public. And, you know, just take public spaces, you know, sort of conceptual concepts, spatial concepts that many of us that engaged over, you know, decades never really enlightened the public interest in such a way. And then suddenly we had COVID, where public spaces became restricted in a very specific, very public way, or restricted to the public in a very specific way. And so we underestimate the importance of some research questions sometimes. The flip side of this is that, and May, I took this in your answer as well, is that we don't tend to say no enough. And I, you know, I agree that this is also the responsibilities on the funders to not have ambitions to have system-wide change and then to offer a couple of £100 here and there to sort of, you know, to affect that change. But we don't, as researchers, as public or as engaged researchers, say no enough to questions that we don't feel justified or we don't feel are responsible in meeting those ambitions of change or transformation. I think you're right that there at times is an industry to respond to calls and to draw in research income without quite balancing out with the responsibilities that you've charted out. There's another question, Pen, and I'm going to pose it to you in terms of how do we navigate the current moment where public engagement infrastructure, like public engagement professionals, is being cut in favor for solely project-based roles. Now, there's a variety of ways you can interpret that, but in terms of what solely project-based roles means. But I think this is that tension that you were alluding to, that sometimes we tend to privilege those that have specific research histories and specific research trajectories at the cost of public engagement professionals. Perhaps a response from you on that.
Thank you. Yeah, wow, that's well, I must again start with a confession. I wish I had a solution that I can propose, but your question really resonated with me because I'm again thinking back to all of the things that an academic has to do, and I'm reminded of this this epic Twitter thread by Dr. Gillian Pepper from 2022, who listed all of the things that she is expected to do as an academic, as a lecturer at a university, and that she is expected to have to do, on a world-leading level, for all of them, right? She has to teach. She has to do all of the preparations for teaching. She has to do pastoral care for the students. She has to do admin work on different levels in the university. She has to write grants. She has to manage research projects. She has to teach and manage different postgraduate students. She has to do the actual research. She has to constantly publish papers. And all of this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? And the list goes on, including public engagement, which she is also expected to do. And she has to do all of this extremely well in order to survive in the academic landscape. And I think this is related to what you're talking about, because at least in the academic context, I think there are two problems with this kind of institution, because on one hand, not everyone thrives in an environment where you're expected to have to do everything so well. The other part is that it actually devalues all of those individual things. So on one hand, you're expected to have to do public engagement really well, but it's one of a million things, and it actually dilutes the value of that. It doesn't really recognize and reward the importance of public engagement work, for example. And I think this is very much related to the fact that I think there is a lack of dedicated public engagement professionals, just as there's a lack of other expertise. I remember I was in a conversation the other day where we were talking about, what would we like a research group to look like in the future? And I was thinking, if I go visit a research group right now, again, I'm like constrained by my really STEM-focused background, but I would be introduced to, for example, the PI, the principal investigator, the professor at the top, and then maybe some postdocs, postdoctoral researchers, PhD students, master students, sometimes undergrads, sometimes technicians, and so on. And all of them, I will be introduced to these titles, and all of them are being trained to have to know how to do everything. What I would love to see is that one day, if I visit a research group and I'm being introduced to them, rather than being introduced to them in this way, I would be introduced to them in a sense where, hey, this is, our artist, who does so much of the important communication work for us. This is our public engagement professional. This is our staff writer. This is our lab technician. This is our field technician. This is the person who does a lot of the statistics. This is our research software engineer, and so on and so on. This is our educator, for example. I think that's the kind of research environment I would love to see, rather than the one that I've experienced in most of my academic career. So I think this is not limited to public engagement, but in order for public engagement to be recognized, I think there are wider systemic issues that need to be addressed in at least academic research. And I bring this up because I think it is important for us to have, wherever we come from, whether we are focused on public engagement or the other things I mentioned, I think it is important for us to have solidarity between all of us who come from these different perspectives with different expertise, so that we can work together to enable that systemic change.
Thanks, Pen. And
Yeah.
that's those are some fascinating ideas. And indeed, what you talk of is quite fundamental sort of system level change of how the higher education sector is set up, not just in the UK, but many contexts where, you know, the academic is indeed expected to just deliver roles that aren't quite understood or defined. And the sort of vision for the future where people do have defined, but also defined roles, but also career paths that are sustainable, that people can join, progress, and develop and grow the breadth and scope of the environment that they work in, is such an important point. And it might seem formulaic to those that don't engage with the university sector, but I think it is one of those transformational moments that I think in environments that really get it are able to do. There's a question in the chat on, you know, how do we convince our institutions? I think it's a two-way street, where there are some institutions that are just better at listening, better at understanding what's driving impactful work, better at characterizing the sort of impact they'd like to see. But equally, it's also, you know, a responsibility for those of us that have senior secure roles to create those moments for change and create those the sort of transformation we want to see. May, can I come to you to ask then, you know, if so Pen's just posed some ideas of what his future expectations look like and what he'd like to see from future research teams. What would you like to see? What are you looking forward to in the next 5-10 years from an engaged public perspective?
Well, again, I think it's just to concur with what Pen has been saying, and again to reinforce this message about the kind of multiple perspectives have to be valued, and the fact that somebody who has worked from a kind of professional end as well as academic end, that research doesn't take place in vacuum, and all these different roles, they have to be valued. They have to be, in a sense, sort of balanced, rather than this kind of hierarchy of roles. One thing that we did talk about in the past is sort of the head key data. So I've just put that in the, I've just put it as a direct chat, sorry. Jada, I'm going to try and put it in the main bit here. And this is basically a kind of data for universities to collect, and what's sort of really not great about it is that professionals don't get seen in this at all. It is very much academics who are sort of their numbers counted, that it's very number game. And so people who are supporting all of this, the impact agenda, the civic agenda, the public engagement agenda, and so forth, just do not get mentioned at all. And that is something that I think absolutely should change, the kind of placing actually valuing people. That's what I would like to change, for it to change, valuing people within the institutions. Not we're not just talking about academics here, but also professional staff, but also outside the institutions too. We're valuing community knowledge, we're valuing community members, we're valuing collaborators and partners and what they bring to the game here. And the fact that actually, I am time and time kind of frustrated by the fact that this is, again, I'm going to keep talking about the time span here. We have to absolutely look at, if we really want to make some change, in a societal change, then we've got to stop thinking in a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year kind of cycles or 5-year cycles, and we have to look at the precarious contracts, and that speaks to, professional as well as academic. And I think that, to me, will make a really massive difference. So we're not just talking about balanced teams here that are, producing the research, but it's also valuing their kind of time too. So yeah.
Thanks so much, May. I mean, that is that speaks to the real core of it, isn't it? That if we can arrive at a way of doing research that actually values those that are part of the research, and who we consider as part of research teams is as broad and inclusive as those ideas demand, that's really a future that we can all aspire to in those responsible ways, and again bringing this to that sense of responsibility around why it is that research requires a public facing, a public engaged role within it. And Paul, you've cheekily put in a little question for me in terms of what I dream as being the future. Besides Liverpool being top of the Premier League, there are I think a vision that perhaps the practical side of me doesn't allow to come out very often. But since you've posed your question as a dream, I think untethered public funding to support engaged research is a hope that I think many of us share. Some do it openly, others have a sort of sense towards what untethered funding might look like. And I think that speaks to points that Penn and May, both of you, have raised, because from what you've shared today and what I had the chance to learn from our earlier chat was that you were able to bring a sense of flexibility to your work at particular points in time. And both of you recognize that as a privilege that you were able to do so. We recognize that there are others who are perhaps at times unable to be that flexible. But for me, if public research funding can spark creativity, can spark imagination by supporting the best ideas in ways that are flexible, in ways that speak to the research community's needs, rather than a sort of top-down vision of what research is and what its impact is. I think that would be a future that I'd hope we're all traveling towards. Right, we've got, I think, a matter of seconds left to the time we were given. So let me first, before we run out of time completely, absolutely thank you, May, for your comments, to absolutely thank you, Penn, for your comments and for sharing your stories. I've certainly learned lots from today. So I've really enjoyed it.
It's been a brilliantly rich discussion, Fen Huan and May and Jaydeep. Thank you so much for sharing your honest reflections. It felt like a really honest session, and lots of love being shown in the chat of people really appreciating the time that you've taken and your really thoughtful comments.